Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be speaking to you all as part of your wonderful and really important organization. The point of the paper is to sort of talk about what's behind, so to speak, the Taj. Obviously, we know a lot about it, but I think what I'd like to say today is kind of look at the sort of politics of aesthetics and beauty in Mughal India and contextualize the building of the Taj and the messaging, the political messaging in it, in sort of the entirety of Mughal reign by referencing a few examples from earlier periods as well. And when we think of the reign of Shah Jahan, right, we think of this big, the most of important monuments. Let's see, can you see the Taj here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Obviously, we have the Taj Mahal. It's a recent picture, well known, images such as the Red Fort, the Lal Killa in Delhi. Probably a little bit less known, the Shah Jahani Mosque in Tata in Sindh, today's Pakistan, and of course the Jama Masjid of Delhi. So these are all, famous buildings that when we think of Shah Jahan's reign, that's what these images kind of immediately come to mind, and they're known all around the world. And of course, we know that, these buildings are constructed. Why? Because the Mughal state in the 17th century was very wealthy and powerful. In fact, the Mughal state is the second wealthiest state in the world in the 17th century after Qing China. Just to give you a comparison, the revenue of the Mughal state in the 17th century is 10 times greater that of England at the same time under King James I. So it's obviously a wealthy state, prosperous state, and so they can build these buildings. So rich and impressive as they are, though, I always wondered, like, what do we make of the beauty of these buildings, in the sense of sort of what was the purpose of aesthetics? Was it simply beautiful because the Mughals had money and they wanted to impress people, or did it actually have a kind of a meaning? And I think that beauty in Mughal art and architecture was actually kind of a separate aspect. It wasn't just a reflection of how much money they had, but it had its own significance. And I would say it also had its own political logic. And the idea was, if you look at the Persian sources from the period, you'll see that creation of beauty was actually a primary reason for Mughal patronage of architecture. Because the idea was that by creating beauty, the Mughal emperors essentially possessed one aspect of divinity, which was deputized to them by God, in that if God could create beauty on earth as the shadow of God on earth, they could also create beauty. And so they would kind of reflected that divine power. So the beauty had to sort of beautiful architecture would recall that function of the emperor. And of course, this idea of turning Hindustan or India, the Mughal Empire, into a garden. Scholars have talked about this, and the idea was that to turn India into like the Garden of Eden, and the emperor, by sitting in the middle of the garden, was like God sitting in the middle of heaven, or the Garden of Eden, or paradise. And scholars have also argued that the garden wasn't just a specific like plot of land with walls, but often extended to all of India. And so the emperors would place their imprints all over their realm. And we know that, again, people know that as early as the reign of Humayun, so if you begin like Mughal Empire under Babur, he's building these specific gardens in Agra and other places, Kabul, and they're delineated spaces, they're walled off. But starting with Humayun, the idea of the garden and its walls start to dissolve and extend beyond the particular structure to actually the city where they're located, and as we see with Shah Jahan and even early with Humayun, to the whole realm. So, the Persian word for a garden is a bagh, chahar bagh, and so on. But I think what we're dealing with here is probably a broader term, and I don't know how many people know Persian, but you'll recognize some of these words. such as Abadi, a place that's flourishing. It's related to the word for Ab or Abad, like Allahabad or Jalalabad or so on. And there are a lot of Arabic words that the Mughal sources use from the root amara, to build. So imarat, like a building, mi'mar is an architect, but it's also used for God. And they use the word ma'mura, a flourishing place, for a region, but it could also be used for the realm as a whole. So what I'm trying to say is that probably if you look at the vocabulary and the terms, the language of the Mughal emperors, this creation of beauty was actually a primary role. And to turn their realm into heaven on earth, turn India into heaven on earth in their minds, and fulfill their roles as the shadows of God on earth. And so we already see these reflected in Persian texts, sources from the early Mughal era, beginning from at least the reign of the second emperor, Humayun, from 1530 until 1556 when he dies. But a lot of, especially if you look at sources from the 1530s, his first 10 years, we definitely see that. And the image you see here is Humayun in, it's called Humayun's garden party. The emperor's, I don't know if you can see I forget what it's called, the mouse moving here. That's the emperor. He's in this sort of pavilion, and then the gardens behind it with people, attending on him. There are these people, faces were changed over time after Humayun. So Akbar is depicted here sitting face to face with him. Obviously, that's an adult Akbar, and Humayun would not know what his son would look like as an adult, or the painters of his reign wouldn't know that. So it's been updated a little bit. But already under him, this sort of scene of garden is reflected in text as well. And there's a number of authors that talk about this. Probably one of the most useful ones in this sense is a poet called Yusufi. He was from the city of Herat in today's Afghanistan. Yusufi came to India when Babur was still alive, and then he became a court poet under Humayun. And so he wrote these various praise poems of different cities in the Mughal Empire at that time. And I wanted to show you some of the language that he uses for different cities. So I'll begin with Agra. Agra, obviously the capital in some ways. And so we have this poem by Yusufi, and he says, "Happy Agra and its heavenly soil, its delightful breeze and its pure water. Agra is like a beloved, full of elegance and beauty." Okay, so Agra is like got this heavenly soil, it's full of beautiful things, just like heaven. Then he writes about Gwalior. He says, "The fort of Gwalior is like the heavens, because it shines with the light of 100 idols that resemble the sun and the moon. Its breeze is like the breeze of heaven, and there are 100 pools in it like Kosar." Kosar is the pool in heaven in Islam, in the middle of the garden. So he's comparing the sort of the pool in Gwalior to heaven. About Jaunpur, he writes, "In its elegance, the city of Jaunpur is heaven. It is filled with beauties everywhere, men and women. The gardener of paradise will never remember heaven again if he once passes by the soil of Jaunpur." So these Mughal cities are obviously represented as each of them is like the Garden of Eden. But then he also, discusses the newly acquired areas. For instance, he writes about Banaras, Varanasi, and he says, "Whoever desires happiness these days will achieve it if he comes to Banaras. Its air, which refreshes my heart and soul, makes you forget the air of the Garden of Paradise. The Garden of Aram," again, it's like the Garden of Eden, "is envious because Benares is blossoming with the faces and statures of idols." When he says the word idols, it's two meanings. He's talking about statues, but it's also referring, in Persian poetry, an idol is used to refer to a beautiful person. So again, it's like heaven, right? And he calls it heaven, but the sort of beautiful people that are there, and the air is pure and so on. And he has similar statements, for example, about the river Ganga. And it says, "The Ganga River serves as the Kaaba for the unbelievers of India." Kaaba is obviously in Mecca, the shrine in Mecca. for Muslim pilgrims. And he says, oh, Ganga is like Kaaba for non-Muslims in India. It looks so pure. Nothing can match its delightfulness in the whole world. If the unbelievers had not done it first, then I myself would surely call it the Kaaba. So here we see that sort of idea of heaven on earth is not just the cities, it's actually the river, right? And the landscape as well. And from other authors of Humayun's time, we have similar statements. For example, in a text written by the emperor's servant, Johar, he talks about how Humayun took Bengal from the Afghans. The Afghans, he said, had kind of ruined Bengal, and Humayun made it beautiful. And this is how he describes it. It says, the realm and the people of Bengal had fallen into ruin and despair from the oppression of the Afghans. There were dead bodies everywhere, and the streets and markets reeked of their bad smell. But thanks to the blessed arrival of the emperor, Bengal prospered, Ma'mushur, and in a short time. And then Humayun renames it Jannat Abad, which means the sort of heavenly place, right? So we see already from the time of Humayun, the role of the emperor is to create heaven on earth wherever he goes. And some of these is because he hasn't built Jaunpur or Banaras, Varanasi or Agra, but his presence makes it so. Now, by the time we get to the reign of Akbar, the third Mughal emperor, and this should show the picture of Akbar. Are you seeing Akbar here? By the time we get to Akbar, now his own construction is contributing to this function. Akbar is the third Mughal emperor, obviously very well known, reigned from 1556 to 1605. And we have long known that Akbar was presented as something of a divine being. And usually people connect that to his institution of this thing called the divine religion, or Deen Ilahi, which was supposed to be a synthesis of various religions under the people, his subjects. Certain rituals involved, and also importantly, perhaps his appearance at the time of sunrise, so that the masses of people can come and look at him and show respect to darshan, But another aspect of his divine presentation was connected to his construction activity. And the Persian sources really emphasize the idea that he, as a builder, was like the creator or God. So, for example, when Akbar is building up in Agra, and I guess he's also started Fatpur Sikri at this time. There's a chronicler by the name of Arif Pandahari, and here in 1577, this is what he writes about, sort of referring to Akbar's work. In the preface, he says, when God brought all the beings of creation into existence, and when he created the three dimensions, the heavens and the earth, then the time for unveiling arrived. He said, that as God said, quote, look at what I have built. It is said in the Quran, again, quote, have they not then observed the sky above them, how we have constructed it, end quote. So what Arif Kandahari is doing, the chronicler of Akbar, is really setting you up for his description of Akbar's construction by going back and talking about God at the beginning, God, creating heavens and earth and so on. And the idea that by creation, through creation, God has unveiled himself, right? His essence has been revealed to humans who can't see him otherwise. And perhaps then what he's suggesting is that Akbar too is then revealing his inner essence or his divine essence to his subjects by building new, magnificent, and beautiful buildings. So this is a kind of a continuation, perhaps a expansion of what we had already seen under Humayun, and we certainly see it under Shah Jahan as well. I've put up Shah Jahan's picture, who we know reigned from 1628 to 1658. He lived longer, but his reign effectively ended in 1658. So Shah Jahan's reign is well known. There's a lot of new scholarship on it. And we know that a lot of the rituals, practices, ideas that had already developed under Humayun and Akbar and to some extent Jahangir, continued and were even expanded under Shah Jahan. For instance, we talked about the darshan that Akbar used to do. Shah Jahan definitely continues that, so people could come and gaze on him. And we also know that he was really involved in the building projects that he's famous today, for which he's famous today. And the main or the perhaps standard chronicle of Shah Jahan's reign early on was by this figure called Abdul Hamid Lahori. He wrote in 1648, referring to how involved Shah Jahan was in construction, supervising the construction of these buildings. And he says, quote, "The superintendents of the workshops that deal with imperial buildings, in conjunction with virtuoso architects, always lay their plans before the emperor's judicious scrutiny. He is greatly concerned with the making of imposing structures and sturdy buildings, which, as the saying goes, quote, verily our monuments signify us." So this is a poem from like mystical poetry, Sufi poetry, again, kind of referring perhaps to some kind of divine statement that monuments reveal the essence. And here too, then, like Akbar, the act of building is shown by Lahori to be a self-revelation on the part of Shah Jahan. There's probably no surprise, Shah Jahan era writers very specifically state that his building projects have definitely turned India into heaven on earth. So, for example, Lahori writes, quote, "The raising up of skyscraping buildings such as mosques that reach for the throne of heaven, as well as palaces and forts, all these things beautify and adorn the world and have made heavenly India flourish," right? So the building itself is part of this, expression of the prosperity and the flourishing of India, which is a heavenly place, heaven on earth. And of course, by extension, you might say, if the emperor has turned India heaven on earth through his creations, doesn't that follow that he's basically like God who created the heavens and the earth? And in fact, Shah Jahani authors, his Persian authors writing under Shah Jahan, very explicitly state that. And a really good person to read for this kind of idea is a poet by the name of Kalim Kashani. He was an immigrant from Iran, and he wrote in 1638 a versified, kind of an epic history of Shah Jahan. This is the book is called Masnavi Padshahnama. There's a lot of Padshahnamas. This one is in verse. So this is what he writes about Shah Jahan and perhaps reflecting that divine function. Kalim writes, quote, "The learned builder, or king of the universe, Shah Jahan, who pays attention to every detail and is a master of the arts, turned his attention to the design of a building. He removed the veil," there's the veil again, "he removed the veil from his beautiful sketch. In making his sketch, he employed so much innovation that it became an illustration in the book of the world. In drawing each sketch, he performed so much sorcery that it ravished people's hearts, even before it was built. One of the names of God is the illustrator, Musawwir. His shadow, Shah Jahan, now has made this clear." So you can kind of see Shah, is describing Shah Jahan, sketches out what the building should be, and it's a beautiful sketch, and it already kind of robs people's hearts, who see the image. And to say that it's a sketch in the book of the world kind of alludes to the idea of perhaps a divine book of some kind. And he's using sorcery in the illustration, perhaps a kind of a miraculous power in the book. So these are sort of religious connotations. And then he says that very specifically, one of the names of God is the illustrator, Musawwir. So if God is an illustrator, Shah Jahan is also an illustrator, and now he's reflecting this, right? He's reflecting that power or manifesting that power of the divine. And again, Kalim is very specific about what this means. He says, quote, Shah Jahan possesses all the characteristics of God. In appearance, he's a king, but in his interior, he's a holy man. And then in some other verse, he says, the emperor is the manifestation of God's benevolence, sorry. Mazhar lutf parvardegar. So, in fact, if you read this text, Kalim had already stated in the beginning of the text that he thought that the act of creation itself was an act of beauty. And it was actually a sign of God's love that he created so much beauty. And he writes very specific, in his book, I quote a verse. He says, because of his pure magnanimity, the absolute benefactor, God, bestowed upon the universe the beauty of being. The world became a garden full of colors and fragrance where humans are like fruit-bearing trees. So you can kind of see, right? I mean, he's taken the Garden of Eden metaphor, but taken it even further. We are like the fruits of the fruit-bearing trees of the garden. And this is all a sign of God's love for people, for life, I suppose. And these ideas, we find these ideas present, obviously, in, many writers before the Mughal era. A lot of Sufi writers kind of use this kind of metaphor language. A famous Sufi thinker, Ruzbahan Baghli, he's from the 13th century. He has ideas like this, and he has a theology that's reflecting this. You find it in popular works of Persian poets like Sa'di, in his Gulistan or Bustan or his poems. They have these ideas. And ultimately, the Sufis had developed this type of theology or philosophy, you might say, all based on certain verses in the Quran or the Hadith, statements either from the Prophet that are passed down, or there are certain Hadith that are supposed to be the direct speech of God. But there's a number of these that the Sufi thinkers of the later era built these ideas out of. And if you've read them, you might recognize these. One of them is, indeed, God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Another one is, blessed is God, the most beautiful of creators. Another one is, we have created human beings in the most beautiful stature. And there's another saying, I was a hidden God, this is God saying, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be recognized, therefore I created. So Sufi thinkers of, not just Sufi, but many Sufi thinkers certainly, took these verses and sort of developed the idea of beauty, the importance of divine beauty and so on, and how a particular manifest beauty can connect us to this divine essence. So as the author Kalim Kashani here, and perhaps in a more subdued way, the court chroniclers are also using this language, we can see that creation of beauty was a key function of the emperor, especially as a shadow of God, or perhaps we might say in his divine essence. And what was the point of this? Why did the Mughals do this? Well, it's probably self-explanatory in that if the emperor is making claims to divinity, part of that should be reflected in this aspect as well. One aspect is justice. The emperor has to sort of bring justice to the people because that's what God wants him to do. He needs to bring security. He needs to bring some level of prosperity. But we don't really think about the beauty part when we think about these pre-modern states, but an important role was also to bring beauty to the people and please their senses, right? So, and recreate heaven on earth. And that's sort of what seems to be referred to here. And so the detail to creating beauty in art, not just imposing structures, but very particular types of refinement, is to sort of ravish the senses, right? Now, beyond that, we can also speculate perhaps that there was a political plot behind this. There's an agenda here. And the idea was, just as the Sufis had said, a kind of an earthly beauty would be a tangible pathway for a person to be connected to divine beauty. So too here, we would say that an actual, tangible, beautiful thing like a building, and of course, not everybody gets to see all the way inside, but at least they see the outside. A tangible beauty would be a way for the subjects of the emperor, and of course, their rank would determine how close they can get and how much of it they could access, but would connect it to him somehow and then generate that love for the emperor. And so that the emperor, the people who didn't really get to see the emperor or get to know him that much, maybe some of them got a glance of him if they lived in the capital, but in other places, they would at least see the beauty that he had created and then feel that love for him. Now we have to think the difference between a modern nation state and the Mughal state. Every state wants to do that. Every state we know wants to create, turn itself right into an object of desire and love. How do modern states do it? They do it through the use of mass media and public education, right? Go forward. If you think about, if you've been to public schooling or any schooling, there's always the map of the country, the bird's eye view on the wall, the flag is there, the national anthem is sung, there's, pictures of great people related to the history of the nation. So the nation is always, there are songs that we sing to it, obviously, not just the anthem, but others. We celebrate it. So it becomes an object of devotion, right? As a thing. The image, especially the image, the map image, the bird's eye view image of the state, which none of us can obviously see because you have to be in space to see that shape. But it's given to us as a thing, as a fetishized object that we can sort of fall in love with and adore. And this goes for any nation state, right? To the point where if there's a little piece of it missing, we would think, oh, there's something off, and the picture is wrong. Well, the Mughals don't have that. They don't even know what their realm looks like from the sky. This would be sort of like the extent of, the greens up to here would be the extent of the Mughal Empire. And the Mughal Empire is not a nation state. So how do you create unity and diversity? How do you fetishize the state as a thing that people can love and adore and feel, good about? And otherwise, it's just a series of towns and garrisons and, very local identities and nothing beyond. And I think that's where the body of the emperor is so important. The emperor himself becomes the focal point. And, we've heard in, 17th century France where, Louis the 14th says, I am the state. Or we hear of other examples where the king's body is the realm. Same kind of idea. Because what is the kingdom is the king is the embodiment of the idea of that state, of that empire. And so you need to get people to focus all their adoration towards this one thing, and the emperor's body is it. But if you can't see the emperor because you don't live in the modern age, the Mughals had different ways of creating that. Certain people who were perhaps more important, obviously certain people would get to see the emperor up close and interact with him. Other people who couldn't really see him closely, they would be given a little picture of the emperor or a family tree, either a kind of a gold coin with a picture of the emperor, and they would put it up in their turban. So there was a variety of ways of attaching people to the emperor. And I think the creation of beauty is an aspect to this. If you're not one of the courtiers, if you're not one of the devotees, but you're one of the many people in the realm, then these buildings, the beauty aspect of the building is not just there to awe you, impress you, and make you feel small. Actually, it's meant to create a sense of love in you through this seeing of beauty. So I think that's the idea behind it. And I think we're at 38 minutes, so I guess I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. So I think I'll just start by saying Sukhi had a question. Ganga and Kaaba was such a great comparison and also sounds so accepting of the culture and religion. I had a sort of a question to tag on to that, which is, uh, was this kind of cultural blending between Islamic Indic symbols? Was it a political strategy, a personal belief system, or kind of a mishmash of both?
Probably a little bit of everything, I would think. So the specific poet that writes this, Yusufi, um, he is a physician, he's a court physician, but he's also a court poet. So because he's a court poet and he writes this poetry, I would think it's not just his personal beliefs. He's reflecting, if not the full beliefs of the emperor, but definitely a kind of a position, let's say, at the Mughal court that wants to essentially equalize or make or translate, right, uh, non-Muslim ideas and symbols into things that make sense in Islam and vice versa. This is an old practice as far back as the time of the Ghaznavids. We have evidence of this attempt of doing this. Al-Biruni, for example, has this notion of, oh, well, he writes, there might be various gods, but if you think about Muslims, many of them also believe in a variety of things, but people who really devote in some ways also believe in one God only in both cultures. So there was a constant attempt all the way back to try to translate or equalize or make things exchangeable, in these. So this is a particularly Mughal expression of that. I haven't personally seen anything like this about the Ganga before the Mughal period. So that seems to be a step beyond what you had seen in earlier eras.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I'm going to ask a very naive question here, which is, uh, if a modern leader was to build something like the Taj Mahal today, we
yeah,
would probably accuse them of vanity and extravagance
yes,
rather than say that
yes.
they're a visionary. Why do you think we judge it so differently in hindsight?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is something that I think about. Where I am in Portugal, there's a lot of kind of old villa-looking like homes just across the street from me, and they're tearing it down and building these sort of boxy high-rises. And it's kind of sad because the old homes have trees in them too. And when you get rid of that, the street has no trees at all. It's just like cement, up and down. So I understand the need because you need housing, but so part of it is, I mean, obviously it's a different society, right? The Mughal state is the agrarian society. 80% of the population are farmers. So they don't really have to worry about, mass housing or anything like that. So if they have money, they're going to put it in these big sort of imposing buildings. The state, the cost of the buildings is actually not that much. Shireen Mousavi had written this article about it. It's actually, compared to the revenues that they're getting, it's actually not that expensive, given how much money they have anyway. Um, Part of it is, to build something, in a pre-modern state, I guess the state is supposed to represent the people, whereas in a modern state, sorry, in a pre-modern state, the state doesn't really represent the people. It represents God to the people, so to speak. So in some ways, you don't have to think about, well, how wasteful am I, by doing this. So maybe those are I don't know if that answers your questions, but I'm thinking maybe those are some factors that
Yeah. Yeah.
play into it.
Uh, Also, when you're talking, you mentioned about how some Persian chroniclers, shape very glowing stories around Shah Jahan, for example.
Yeah.
What do Shah Jahan's court histories tell us about how he wanted to be remembered? I mean, how reliable are those accounts when compared to what actually happened? Is there a way that we can actually know that?
Yeah, there is a way. I mean, that's obviously how he wants to be seen. Even within these texts, there are differences. So, poetic texts tend to be more, uh, you might say, exaggerated and sort of free flowing and a little bit more daring in general. If I would generalize the genres, the chronicles are a little bit more reserved. So, a prose chronicle, perhaps because it's going to be sent to courtiers in other courts, right? Like the Chronicle of Shah Jahan's reign is going to go to Iran and to the Ottoman Empire, and they're going to read it. So I think there you have to think about sort of diplomatic fallout if you make really grandiose claims. But in terms of poetry, there seems to have had a little bit greater license. So even within the pro Shah Jahan view, you have these differences. And then obviously the texts that are written, like there's an author called Muhammad Saleh Kambu, who writes sort of he's writing towards the end of Shah Jahan's reign, and then Aurangzeb overthrows his father, and then he completes the text under Aurangzeb. It's very clear that he's going back and sort of changing things to make sure Aurangzeb looks good and Shah Jahan starts to look bad at some point. So you have that, and then you have this sort of accounts from European travelers uh, that are probably reflecting. Jadunat Sarkar was a early author. He calls it bazaar gossip. It's just people saying all these nasty things about the emperor. So it doesn't necessarily always, translate. Um, so I guess they do what they can, and then the reception is a you know, whole other story. Yeah.
So, well, Arun had a question. The emperors after Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, and others aren't known as builders of beautiful architecture. Why
Yeah,
did the concept of building beauty as God's shadow disappear with the Mughal emperors after Shah Jahan?
that's a really good question. And I have to say, this is, we're waiting for my colleague Munis Faruqi's book. He's at Berkeley. He's writing a book on Aurangzeb. And I'm sure he can shed more light on it. My sense is that the thing that you brought up about wastefulness is actually perhaps an issue, maybe a bigger issue in the later 17th century, in the sense that Aurangzeb has his turn towards simplicity, move away from luxury. He dresses really simply. He's campaigning constantly. So that seems to be a thing, and that does fit in a somewhat global trend in the late 17th century, where there's criticism of wastefulness by the kings and so on. And you find it in England, you find it in Iran also, and to some extent you find it in Louis XIV's reign. The first half of Louis XIV is like Versailles and just like, but then towards the end you see him move away from that. There's a book called Lust for Virtue that discusses that. There's a kind of attempt to bring, virtue back, move away from vice. The king himself stops going to the theater. He doesn't ban it, but he wants to like not do that as much. And so it could be a reflection. I mean, there are still buildings under Aurangzeb, and in terms of aesthetic judgment, one might judge it one way or another, um, and think some of them are grandiose. But it seems like perhaps there's a little bit more of that as we move forward in time. And then I would say the 18th century, you actually do have really beautiful, refined buildings, maybe on a smaller scale. But if you think about the various like nizams and so on, and the work that's done in Hyderabad, Lucknow, Awadh, in Rajasthan, Jodhpur, and so on, you have that, but perhaps on a smaller scale.
Jyoti Kerkar had a question actually, which I also thought of when you said it. And she asked, "Am I right to think that Shah Jahan was an artist slash architect as well?"
It seems like that's what they're saying. If you read the sources, in one source they say they would bring the plans to him, and he kind of makes, I don't know, comments or corrections. And in other cases, he seems like he sketches. This is what I want done, and then maybe turns it over to professionals to convert that vision into an actual. So he seems to be some kind of artist. And he also was interested, if I remember the passage correctly, in the paintings. He would want to look at the paintings. I don't remember, and there are people who I'm sure can answer this much more satisfactorily than I, but I don't know if he painted himself. I know Humayun painted. Shah Jahan might have, but in the passage, I know that he definitely was interested in how these images in the sort of famous miniatures that we know, he would look over some of that. So he had definitely the artistic vision.
Yeah. So talking about kind of the Taj Mahal, I guess we treat the Taj Mahal as kind of the ultimate symbol of romantic love. But is that,
Yeah.
I mean, were contemporaries talking about it that way at all? Was that element an important part of how they saw it?
Yeah, and the scholar Eba Koch has an article, and actually a number of works on this, a whole book on this, but also a number of articles where she discusses that specifically. But I mean, there is definitely romantic love, and if you read the text, he's very saddened when Mumtaz Mahal dies. But it's also a kind of, I think it's also a moment in the 17th century where you do have this series of very well-known sort of public active queens. They were there before too. If you look at 16th century, you have the sort of like the foster mothers or Akbar's own mother who's really powerful. In the 17th century, the wives are very important. And so you have a series of people, and they're very wealthy. So we're talking about wives and daughters here, um, from Nur Jahan, right, down to Zebun Nisa, Aurangzeb's daughter. They're very wealthy, and they're patrons. So I think in some ways it's beyond the romantic love. I think it's interesting that you do have this monument to her at a juncture where you just had essentially a reigning queen in Nur Jahan, and you also have very politically active and wealthy princesses coming down the line, his own daughters, right, Shah Jahan's daughters. So I think it also reflects beyond perhaps the romantic aspect, the really big position, political position of these Mughal queens, that are being, I don't know, reflected maybe a little bit more in the 17th century than before, much more visually. I mean, Noor Jahan like signs documents, imperial farmans, in her own name. So that's probably more than if you can think of previous queen mothers. So it might be also a moment.
Yeah, actually, I'm so glad you touched on that because I wanted to ask this, which is, we the women in the court, right? The mothers, the wives, the daughters. Uh, it seems like they were all somehow part of the political machinery. Uh,
Mhm.
do Persian sources suggest that they had influence in state affairs or imperial culture? And if they did have any real political clout, why are they so often missing or sidelined in chronicles? I mean, is this
Yeah.
deliberate, or do we need to read kind of the silences differently?
They're probably not as well represented as they had power, right? In the sense of like, if you read what people write about Noor Jahan outside of what Jahangir writes, of course, this is, we have to read, those interested, Ruby Lal has a book on this, and Corinne Lefebvre has a book on Jahangir. It talks about these in detail. I'm just summarizing their findings. But essentially, like, if you read, say, Jahangir's text, she's there, but you get a negative presentation of her in either 17, sort of post Jahangir text that want to blame her, because Shah Jahan essentially rebels against his own father, right? I'm sorry, yeah, Shah Jahan does. So in some ways, they want to blame her for what happened to curry favor with Shah Jahan. And you also have these European authors. There's a Pelsart, Dutch author, who says a lot of negative things about her. But if you look at what he's saying, he's saying that this is bad for business. And what I'm hoping is that Shah Jahan is going to come, and then we're going to be able to do business again. So it doesn't really reflect her quality as such, but it kind of people writing from the other end of the people who are not winning, or people who have to justify. So it's there in the text. I think there you can find evidence of it, and you also find evidence of them sort of patronizing buildings and so on, and that's the old tradition. Um, but I think we also have to kind of change our perspective, and that's happening now also in scholarship. Whereas perhaps an earlier generation of scholars would take very literally a condemnation of a queen like Nur Jahan, um, and said, well, that's what it says, and that's how she was. Now people are able to read around that and sort of understand better. And again, the books by Lefebvre and Ruby Lal are good examples for that specific figure of Nur Jahan.
Well, Kuldeep asked the question. Aurangzeb was known to be more religious, in brackets, less secular, question mark, and more simpler, as you said. Is there any event or circumstance which might have shaped him this way? Also, the Mughal Empire reached its greatest extent under him.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people also have written about, um, what that specifically means. Obviously, there are particular symbolic things that are not being done. I mean, sure, and there might be a personal piety for sure. But to be sure, that's not in the whole realm. And in fact, as people have, like Catherine Schofield has argued, a lot of these kind of get diffused to local courts as imperial patronage, perhaps kind of pulls back from these things, the arts, for example, paintings and so on. These artists end up being, patronized by local courts. So it doesn't go away. It's just that the emperor seems less interested. But there's still, I mean, there's still, like I said, there's still buildings. We still have some written sources from the time of Aurangzeb. Um, but I don't know, if I were to go out on a limb, I would perhaps say that, you could say that in his, that perhaps there is an attempt to overcome uh, certain what he sees as like, or what some people probably saw as overindulgence or whatever in the time of Shah Jahan. Um, I think a lot of this stuff we have to also think of how this stuff was remembered in retrospect. Munis Faruqi uh, has made this argument that if you look at some of this what has been left behind from the time of Aurangzeb, often are from the 18th century, people looking back and saying, "This is a bad time. That was a good emperor. He was simple. He was pious. He was manly. He was this." Look, and then so the letters, for example, that have been collected and survived are reflecting people sort of thinking, okay, this is how things should be. So in some ways, Aurangzeb is idealized as such in the 18th century. And so that image, so the reception of the image is an interesting progression also. And so, yeah, Munis Faruqi's book is going to come out, I think, next year. And I refer everyone to that book about Aurangzeb. Mhm.
Okay. Suki had two comments, which I'm combining. One is how interesting to think of beauty along the same lines as justice and wealth.
Mhm.
And I think she follows on to say sort of a point that you were making earlier, which is I guess today's leaders need to build modern temples of technology to compensate. The beauty part is the missing element.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
true.
Um,
Uh,
and also, I guess what is defined as beauty, right? Like people often use the term modernity. Oh, we have to make
mm,
this is old. We got to make it modern. So there's like glass buildings, shiny. That's
yeah,
supposed to be have that kind of sensation of beauty, not necessarily a refined handiwork, in a
absolutely.
building. Yeah.
Um, Bharati's question, along with these beautiful monuments, were there any urban planning innovations during his reign?
Yeah, I mean, the whole Shah Jahanabad is built in this period, what we call today Old Delhi. Um, so that's, and other parts, other areas. So there's a lot of urban building as well. Yes.
Jyoti makes a comment. I think I believe the documentation of Mughal rule is still intact, so we can summarize so well, right? I guess it's trying to say that there is
Yeah,
enough
there's a lot of
sources.
documentation from the Mughal era, um, in different, different states, different types of sources have survived, but there's still, I think, quite a lot. And they're in Persian, but also a variety of vernacular languages, from Marathi to Rajasthani
Yeah.
to Pashto, you name it, they have it. So yeah, there's a great resource base for Mughal history. If anyone here is interested, I encourage them to look into it.
This last question really draws on your background, if I may say so. So you worked across multiple empires, periods. Do you see similar patterns where rulers use aesthetics, monument building to shape how kind of people feel about authority, national identity, those elements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we have a recent book by Catherine Babayan on Isfahan and the building that took place under Shah Abbas. So you have these sort of beautiful murals of the building itself, fireworks processions that would happen in the city, and the whole, yeah, there's very much an intent to say this is like, the king has essentially created heaven on earth here. And this is a sort of carbon copy of, or some, similar to it, of heaven, Garden of Eden, paradise. There's a lot of these sort of references to a heavenly recreation. And of course, it's not a new idea, right? I mean, a lot of old, the garden and the palace in the middle, the emperor and his court. If you look at like how the Byzantines represented what they thought heaven looked like, it's kind of reflects the Byzantine court, you know, with God looking like the Byzantine emperor and things like that. But definitely in the 17th century, yeah, beautification, we definitely have examples of that in the Safavid era, and I'm sure the Ottomans as well.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful evening listening to you. Getting to see the perspective beyond the marble facade of the Taj Mahal to look at
Right.
the kind of political, economic, cultural forces that continue to make
Yeah.
it such an interesting monument. So thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you.
Uh, Wonderful to have you. And all of you, thank you for joining us this evening. Look forward to having you all visit us next week as well. So thank you and have a great weekend. And thank you again,
Thank
Professor
you.
Anusha.